Hello, and welcome to Controversies in Church History. This is the podcast. We delve into all the most controversial, important, memorable events, persons, ideas in the history of the Roman Catholic Church. Hello, my name is Derek Taylor. Welcome, and thank you for listening. I really appreciate all you listeners out there. I'm going to take the time to let you guys know I am on... you can find our podcast, which is free, pretty much on most platforms. Spotify, iTunes, and so on and so forth. And on YouTube, please, if you would, go and subscribe if you like this, if you haven't already. If you have a friend you think would like it, go and tell them about it. Again, it's free, so it costs you nothing, so it's a good thing. But I appreciate you help spread the word about this stuff. You can also find me on Facebook at Controversies in Church History. Please go and like the page. I have announcements and stuff there, as well as my website, churchcontroversies.com, have links to all the episodes on there of the podcast, as well as links to my articles. I write articles for Crisis Magazine and other places. I have a blog, which I will get to every once in a while, so there's more info up there if you would like it. I also want to give a shout out to my friend Parker. He has a podcast. It's called Catholicism in the Car. It's a short podcast. I think it's like 15 minutes or the length of the episodes. So please go check out his podcast. It's a great idea because I don't generally like listening to long podcasts, and I'm trying to keep these episodes under an hour for you guys. So it's a good idea. Go ahead and check out his podcast, Catholicism in the Car. I want to thank Parker for he's supporting my podcast. I want to support his. So go check that out, please, if you would. So get now to business. The episode for today is episode's titled Kulturkampf, the German War Against Catholicism, 1871 to 1890. So what are we talking about? What is Kulturkampf? What is that? This refers to the effort of the German Empire, the national German state, from 1871 to about 1890, mostly in the state of Prussia. There are states within that empire, to pass laws to give the state control over and to subjugate effectively to the state, the Catholic Church, and its institutions, its schools, its religious orders, its property, primarily to free what the German government saw as its state, its citizens, from foreign control, meaning the Pope. Now, this term, I have to go into this term for a second. I won't belabor this too much, but the term Kulturkampf, and I'm using that term for a reason. The word Kultur, I won't go into this here, means something kind of different than what we think it does in English. And it refers more or less, the term is something like civilizational struggle, is what it sort of translates to. It was coined by a man named Rudolf Virchow, who was an atheist and a materialist, but also a liberal politician, member of the German Liberal Party in Prussia, in 1873, in the midst of this Kulturkampf, this culture, well, you could call it culture war. That's why I bring the term up. The term culture war was kind of coined and popularized by an evangelical scholar named James Davison Hunter in the 1980s and 90s. And he was thinking of the Kulturkampf, but not quite the same thing. Kulturkampf sort of means something like you have, I'm trying to put it in these terms, Kultur meant something very specific to Germans. Culture, we use the word culture in English English, go with English. English, it means something that's sort of common to all countries. Do you have culture or not? They meant something kind of specific to a nationality, like to their nation, their Kultur. It was unique to them. And that's kind of what's at the back of this is this, well, I'm going to get into the causes of this conflict. One of them is nationalism. That's not kind of what James Davison Hunter was kind of obliquely referring to this. He meant it was an analogy, and there's an analogy to make. I'll get to it later on, but he was thinking of domestic disputes, like, fights over school curricula, the teaching of evolution in schools, sex stuff, that sort of thing in a domestic sense. Whereas something broader is implied by Virchow, like between modernity, modern national civilization represented by Germany, and this backward medieval institution of the papacy and the Catholic Church. And the causes of this are kind of deep. I'll go over them briefly, but again, the rise of modern nationalism in the 19th century, the idea of the modern nation state, which has to have, one territory, one ethnicity, one language, one government, That's very much a part of that's a modern notion of nationalism and what a nation is. Industrialization, the turning of Germany into a great industrial power, the with the bringing along of all the class problems that brings with it. Migration, from the rural areas to the big cities because of industrialization, huge problem. A cause of this Kulturkampf. Another cause is the growth of the press in the 19th century. And I mean not just the secular press, but the growth of a Catholic press. We'll get to that in a moment. Actually, it's bound up with we'll get to the moment, the ideology of ultramontanism. And the growth of that press, it makes, of course, popular opinion widespread. And so you have these warring camps of anti-clericals throughout Europe, not just in Germany, but it's a European-wide phenomenon, who depict the church in these, stark terms, backward, medieval-looking, the epitome of all that is not modern, and all, again, everything modern being good. Opposed to what's called ultramontanism. Ultramontanism comes from the word ultramontane, which means beyond the mountains. And it refers to Catholics who appealed to the Pope. He's the person who lies beyond the mountains if you're in Germany, which is where more or less where that term comes from an earlier period. But it means a sort of reliance on and exaltation of the Pope as the spiritual leader of Catholicism in the 19th century, mostly in reaction to the actions of liberal anti-clerical governments in the 19th century, who were doing things like seizing church property, expelling religious orders. That's one thing you'll get here is that what actually occurs in the Kulturkampf isn't really unique. Lots of governments do it. We'll talk about this in a second, why it has that resonance nevertheless. But ultramontanism was against. It could be a very extreme at times. It was against any sort of compromise with modern governments. It was definitely opposed to liberal Catholicism in the 19th century. Liberal Catholicism as, Catholics who wanted to make peace with the modern state, who wanted to, who saw in ideals of religious liberty something they thought was the ideal for the church, which again they couldn't accept that in the 19th century, and you really can't accept the full extent of that anyway if you're Catholic, because you can't come out and say that Catholicism is it's just one choice among many. That won't work. So you have all that going on there. You also have a part of the reason for this Kulturkampf is there's a religious revival going on in much of Catholic Europe in the early and middle decades of the 19th century. We tend to think of, in the popular image, secularization of Europe happening, starting with the French Revolution and kind of going forward in a straight line to today. It's not quite true. There was a revival starting in depending on when you date it, 1830s or 40s in places like France and then Italy, and also Germany, definitely from the 1850s. There's a revival. There's a rise in numbers of vocations to the priesthood, rise in number of vocations to religious orders, rise in number of Catholics. And it basically begins to peter out in the 1870s, but it's not a straightforward thing. And this revival also led to greater what's called confessionalization. This is the idea that the state, like in Germany in particular, German Protestants thought this would be a Protestant state when Germany became a modern nation state. And so that leads to more rivalry between Protestants and Catholics. And the thing to note about all of this is this gets into a sort of war of responses to all these modern developments, right? Again, the press, industrialization, all those sorts of things, by a couple of different camps, the liberal anti-clerical forces in Germany and across Europe, but also the church itself. And this is the thing, is these are both modernizing responses in the sense that even the church doesn't modernize its beliefs, but it modernizes its structure. I mean, it begins to centralize itself on the papacy in a way it has not before. This is partly brought about by these modern nation states because they're taking away so many of the privileges that bishops in their countries used to have. They're taking away their property. The bishops are kind of powerless now to stop the Pope from basically claiming a lot of practical authority he didn't have before, and doing things that he had a freer hand than he ever had before. And so a lot of the church's focus becomes focused on the papacy as a result. So this is a modernizing event here, even in the church. And again, I'm not saying it obviously doesn't modernize its beliefs. It makes a point of not doing that, but it is a response in several ways, which we'll talk about here. And in terms of who, like I want to get into who's a part of this story here. A few names to mention. First, and probably most important, is will become the Chancellor of the German Empire, Otto von Bismarck, the German statesman he's a Prussian statesman, who's behind the creation of Germany, which I'll get to in a second. And he guides its policy from mid-1860s in Prussia and then 1871 in Germany, once it becomes the German state, to 1890. Second figure here is Pope Pius IX. He's elected in 1846. In 1848, he's driven from Rome by a revolution, and he becomes an anti-modern, anti-revolutionary crusader the rest of his life. He's hugely important. A couple other... They're players, they're not people, but they're parties. And they're parties within the Prussian and German state. And one is the German National Liberal Party. This is the secular liberal party in Germany. They're the ones that will be definitely behind a lot of what's going on here. The other party is the Center Party in Germany, which is actually created as a result of the Kulturkampf, or more or less around the same time as it. And the Center Party I call it the Center Party because it's what they call themselves, but it's actually mostly made up of Catholics. It's a Catholic party. Even though they don't have a confessional identity, they definitely are there to prevent some of the stuff happening to Catholics. And so I mentioned, Germany, okay, it becomes a modern nation. What do I mean by that? If you don't know, prior to 1871, there was no nation of Germany and never had been. There was a region called Germany. There were German-speaking countries. There had been throughout the Middle Ages a body called the Holy Roman Empire, which was a collection of German principalities and princedoms and things like this. It was eventually done away with by Napoleon, or because of Napoleon in the early part of the 19th century, and replaced following the Napoleonic Wars by something called the German Confederation, made up of about 40 or so states, smaller states, the most important of which were Prussia and Austria. Austria was the German-speaking Catholic country, right? Austrian Empire, Austrian monarchy, and then Prussia was the sort of Protestant power in that confederation. And what happens is that, of course, you have, in the 19th century, you have multiple revolutions. There's a big set of revolutions in 1848, starting in France, but spreads to the rest of Europe, and particularly to Prussia, because Prussia was behind the creation of the German state. And in Prussia, because of mob action, they have to placate them. They give them a parliament, a Landtag, I think is how you pronounce it. They attempt actually to create a pan-German parliament, a Reichstag, which they won't get around to until later. But they do manage. They eventually put down the revolution as the Prussian king, but they give them a constitution which remains. So it's a weird, both Prussia and later on Germany is very weird. They're both militarized states, but they also have a constitution and a public assembly. And that constitution of 1850, which is given to the Prussians, gives Catholics a lot more freedom. And of course, this is occurring during this, Catholic revival. And so this ramps up Protestant and liberal, but definitely Protestant hostility for the first time in a long time. Protestantism is becoming more, I put this, liberal in its theological leanings. There are still conservative Protestants in Germany, don't get me wrong, but it's becoming generally more liberal in that sense. But also, it's happening at the same time, this Catholic revival, that Protestantism in Germany is, formal observance is declining. So this leads to a lot of anxiety on the part of, and resentment on the part of Protestants. Throughout the 1850s, this begins to increase for a variety of reasons. One of which is, on the papal side, is the unification of Italy. Italy had been a bunch of collection of states. It's unified behind the Kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia in 1859, 1861. And that, of course, leads to a lot of anxiety. They're seizing church property and doing stuff like that, too. And then in the next year, in 1862, you have Otto von Bismarck becoming effectively the first minister of the Prussian state. Again, further events push this forward. 1864, the Vatican issues the Syllabus of Errors. This is the condemnation of errors associated with modern thinking, which is, by the way, kind of hastily written and the Pope didn't even have time to look at it before they published it. And to say the least, it pissed off liberals across Europe. It cemented the popular image in a lot of their minds that the church was just this benighted, anti-modern, just imbecilic institution from an earlier age that need to be gotten rid of. A couple of years after this is more important, is the victory of Prussia over Austria in the Austro-Prussian War. I think it took like 3 weeks. The Prussians defeat Austria in a war. This makes them the dominant power in the German Confederation. And in fact, they sort of recreate it as the so-called North German Confederation. You know, Protestant North against the Catholic South. Southern states, some of the southern states of German Confederation, Bavaria, a couple others are Catholic. At the same time, this is fateful here, is that within the Prussian Landtag, the Prussian parliament, Bismarck makes allies with the Liberal Party. So he's throwing his lot with the liberals. And I have to emphasize what liberal means in the 19th century. It means, therefore, things like individual property rights, individual freedoms, freedom of the press, freedom of religion. They are secular. That party is. They don't like religion, want to get the church out of public life if they can. This is one thing about them, though, is that the liberals, and this is different from a modern liberal, contemporary liberal. Liberals in the 19th century are firmly nationalistic, the majority of them. That's why he allies with them. A lot of them dream of having a unified German state behind Prussian power. In any event, resentments against Catholicism keep building in the wider German culture. And this actually comes to a head even before the beginning of the Kulturkampf. Historians have identified an event that happened in 1869 when mobs in Berlin, not just Protestant, there are other types in there, attacked several times a Dominican orphanage in a place, I think it's a suburb of Berlin called Moabit. And they besieged this orphanage. Then the monks and the nuns had to flee at one point, partly because there was this image that was sort of promoted in the anti-Catholic press, liberal Protestant especially, that religious orders especially were the sort of epitome of everything that was backward about Catholicism. These archaic ideas of taking vows, this unnatural idea of celibacy, this idea of confessing to a priest and handing your intellect over to them and basically becoming a robot for them. But also, of course, the sexual part of it, right? This is idea that if you're a good Protestant patriarch, you should be out there making babies. It's an unmanly thing to give up your sexuality. And then, of course, there's all these lurid tales, right? This goes back to the Reformation period, even before that, of monasteries being dens of iniquity, where women are forced into it, like it's being forced into prostitution or something like that. They're forced to go into these religious orders. And so these stories get circulated in the popular press, these cheap dime store novels about women being abducted and taken to the convent, rile people up. And so they go in there and they hear. Actually, there's a news report of someone of a Polish nun. I guess it happens in Poland, being taken to a convent somewhere in Germany, and the mobs descend on this religious order, looking for this, trying to save women and stuff like this. Which is all made up, by the way. But the tension, the conflict sort of centers on something like this, which is also, again, caused by, again, I mentioned industrialization and stuff like this. Berlin becomes a great industrial city in the 19th century, and you have a lot of Catholics moving in from other parts of Germany, and so their Catholic population's rising. And so there's a lot of tensions over that as well. So you have all these things in the background setting off this conflict. But what really gets the Kulturkampf as a legal political thing going is the victory of Prussia again in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71. They defeat the French Empire under Louis Napoleon's nephew, take him prisoner at the Battle of Sedan. And eventually, in early 1871, they proclaim the creation of the German Empire, the German Reich, from the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles in France. And the thing to remember about this is an important point here to remember is that when they create this German state, they call it an empire. It's still really not in terms of its actual authority. It's still really a confederation of different states because they don't just absorb every single state, because there are a lot of them who have their own traditions, their own legal systems, their own representative bodies. And in fact, within this German Reich, there are 4 kingdoms, 5 duchies, 7 principalities, 3 free cities, and a partridge in a pear tree, which is to say is like there's a lot of different. It's a federal system with a lot of moving parts, And not all the power is with the central, national government. Most taxation powers are still reside with these states. And beyond this, there are, because they've conquered new territory, both in the north, they conquered what had been part of Denmark, so they have an enclave of ethnic Danes in the north. In the east, they've conquered part of Poland. They have a Polish minority in the east. In the west, they conquered part of French territory in 1871, Silesia, so they have Silesians who are French-speaking. They have a bunch of different ethnic minorities in this state. In other words, it doesn't fit the model of what your good chauvinistic 19th century nationalist wants. One language, one culture, one set of laws. It has all these pockets of, if you want to put it that way, diversity, which they're kind of, well, you'll see, it'll become a problem in the eyes of people like Bismarck. Other thing that begins to set this off, of course, besides that, is the First Vatican Council. If you don't know, the Italian kingdom was bearing down on Rome. Its troops enter Rome in 1870 during the First Vatican Council, conquers it, makes it part of the capital of Rome, leaves the Vatican alone, but still the Pope hates them for this. Pius IX never forgives the Italian government for this. He actually forbids Catholics in Italy from participating in public life whatsoever because of this. In any event, Vatican I, of course, among other things, proclaims the infallibility and of the Pope and the primacy of the Pope over the Church. And there are lots of reasons it does this, and there are reasons to do this that are essentially theological, basically to clarify the fact that the Pope's authority does come from God. It's not dependent on his temporal power, which is now gone. But it's also partly a political move by the Vatican. This is a way of basically thumbing its nose at liberal governments across Europe who, to be fair to the Vatican, they have been conquering their territories, taking their property, taking the church's property. But of course, this causes an almighty row across Europe. Liberals everywhere are offended by this. Again, it reconfirms for them that the church is this backward, superstitious, left over from an earlier age. And so it leads to, several things it leads to. What already happens even before the Vatican Council, I forgot to mention this is actually a result of the attack on the Dominican orphanage, is the founding of the Center Party in Prussia. It's a response to all the attacks. It's meant to sort of protect Catholics in Prussia. But other states begin using Vatican definition of papal infallibility as an excuse. The first of which, by the way, of all these kingdoms is actually Austria. Austrian liberals had gained a foothold in the Austrian parliament, and they used that as a pretext to abrogate the Concordat that had been signed with the papacy in 1855. And the Austrian liberals also were the first ones to do something that other countries would do, which is that they started to cultivate the so-called Old Catholics. Old Catholics were Catholics who refused to accept the decrees of Vatican I, and who formed their own schismatic church. They got, long story short, they had ordination from another schismatic church, and they're still around today, the Old Catholics in Europe. They're very, very liberal, theologically speaking, but they're still around. And Austrian liberals begin courting them as replacements for Catholic priests. You'll see this, we'll go to this, it happens in several places. But also in Switzerland, which is a majority Protestant country, but it has a Catholic minority. Protestant cantons, those sort of smaller units of the Swiss state, in some places are just given Catholic churches. They're taken away from them for Protestant use. So all this is leading up to 1871, when the Prussian government decides it's had enough of what it sees, Bismarck sees especially as a fifth column in the state. And so it starts in the Prussian government. The government there in 1871 abolishes. They have a Ministry of Education and Public Worship, which is basically to look over the churches, and there's a Catholic bureau within it. They abolished the Catholic bureau, and this is sort of the opening volley of hostilities. In that same year, they pass a law, something that comes to be called the Pulpit Law, which punishes criticism of the state by clerics who, and I quote here, treat state matters in a manner that threatens the public peace. So this is a direct, assault on Catholic priests who might be preaching against all this stuff. Next year, 1872, Bismarck makes the liberal politician Adalbert Falk Minister of Education and Public Worship, And he begins to guide through a series of laws through the Prussian parliament. Particularly the first passes a law that year which subjects all religious schools to state inspection. That June, they pass a law which excludes all members of religious orders from education and gives the Jesuits 6 months to leave the country. By the end of the year, 500 religious have left the country as a result of these laws. The Center Party immediately begins criticizing this, along with the episcopate, the Prussian bishops. In particular, they point out that Kulturkampf, these laws were a breach of the Constitution. There were supposed to be guarantees of this in the Constitution, which a few years later, the government quietly gets rid of those clauses in the Constitution. So they were actually right, but it didn't do any good at the time. At the same time, those bishops forbade Catholics to implicate themselves in any way in the enforcement of the new laws, as did Pius IX. He called on German Catholics to resist what he called, quote, the persecution of the church in 1872. He refused when Bismarck nominated a cardinal for imperial ambassador to accept him. And this is the context of the famous remark, if you know this. Bismarck famously responded to this, that we shall not go to Canossa, unquote, quote unquote. If you know what he's referring to an earlier event, about 800 years earlier in the 11th century, in which the earlier Holy Roman Empire, the old medieval German Empire, the Emperor Henry IV was excommunicated by the Pope at the time, Gregory VII, and there was a sort of standoff between them, and eventually Henry IV gave in and went to Canossa and submitted to the Pope, and so he had to withdraw the excommunication. This was Bismarck basically saying, we're not backing down, and he immediately also severs diplomatic ties with the Holy See. And things just ramp up from there, both in Germany and elsewhere. The next year in May, they pass a series of laws that come to be called the May Laws, which, among other things, require seminarians to be German nationals. Again, there's that ethnic component coming on here as well, but also to study 3 years in a German university and to submit to what they call the Kulturexamen, which is a series of examinations in things like literature, history, and philosophy. And again, think about the ethnic component here in this German empire. It has all these ethnic minorities. This will all be in German, this education, I presume. But it also, these laws submit clerical appointments by bishops, appointments of priests, to government veto. As well as they can nullify a bishop's, he wants to send a priest somewhere, they can't do it. It also tries to place restrictions on episcopal powers of excommunication, which that's a totally religious thing. They're trying to restrict this. And it actually restricts appeals made against these episcopal decisions by priests to a newly created civil tribunal. Again, the whole point of this is to try to neuter the religious power of the church so it can't use that power for political ends. Same time, similar things are happening in Switzerland. In Basel, Bishop Eugène Lachat is expelled from the country for opening ecclesiastical proceedings against priests who refuse the decrees of Vatican I. In Jura, a place in I think it's in Jura, a place in Switzerland. There's a protest against these types of expulsions. Priests that are faithful to their bishops are forced from their parish and replaced by old Catholic priests. So you have them being replaced by this, again, they're trying to replace them with a more recalcitrant. The old Catholics, by the way, were more nationalistic in their ecclesiology. So that's part of the reason they do that. And then in Geneva, Bishop Gaspard Marmiot is deposed and expelled as well for trying to establish an episcopal see there. So lots of this going on. Again, it spreads beyond Prussia to other parts. And there are other parts, by the way, I should say, of Germany itself, other states. Baden, Hesse-Darmstadt, and even in Catholic Bavaria, you have Kulturkampf laws passed there. Even despite all this, the Center Party, the Catholic Party, increases its numbers in the next elections in 1874, both in the Landtag, in the Prussian parliament, but also the Reichstag. Nevertheless, Bismarck continues. He doubles down. That same year, a Polish archbishop in the country, in Prussia, Archbishop Ledakowski, is arrested for teaching the catechism in Polish. That same year, a second set of May laws is passed, which at the same time makes recalcitrant bishops and priests liable to deposition and exile. That year, archbishops of Cologne and Trier are arrested. And part of the reason, by the way, for the passage of that law is that same year, you also have an attempt by a Catholic to assassinate Bismarck. I don't think he's associated with the bishops or anything like this, but again, this all ramps things up. You can imagine how tense things are getting. Again, same year, another set of May laws is passed by the Austrian Parliament, which restricts the church's legal position, the rights of religious orders. It places church funds under state control, imposes upon bishops the obligation of notifying the state concerning ecclesiastical appointments. So again, all this attempt to sort of get control of the church institutionally. In Switzerland, they amend the federal constitution to prohibit the establishment of new dioceses or monasteries without the federal government's consent. Jesuits and other religious orders are expelled from the country. The papal nuncio is basically kicked out of the country, and diplomatic relations with the Holy See are severed until 1884. At the same time, this is also a big thing I don't have time to go in here. One of the big points of contention between liberal governments and the church in the 19th century, especially in formerly Catholic countries, would be civil marriage, because of course the church wanted to claim throughout the century to have jurisdiction over that. Switzerland makes civil marriage obligatory. It makes obligatory all schools, private and public, that they be mixed, interdenominational. Again, this is an attack on the Catholic educational system. And things reach their peak really around 1875. Pius IX, in that year, declares the May laws, all of them, null and void, threatens any Catholic who attempts to help enforce them with excommunication. Again, things are ramped up about as far as you can get them. Civil marriage is made obligatory in Prussia in that year. Later on in other German states, they do the same thing. Later on in April, the Landtag, the Prussian parliament, passes the so-called breadbasket law, which basically suspends any sort of financial grants in dioceses where the law was not being obeyed about civil marriage. So again, they're trying to force the church's hand by taking any sort of state support away from it. In May, all religious across the entire country, except those engaged in hospital work, are expelled. In June, all church property, and this is all in Prussia, by the way, all church property is confiscated, and the title to it is transferred to lay trustees elected by parishioners. By 1877, there are thousands of parishes with no pastors, and 9 of the 12 Prussian bishops are in exile. As late as 1881, a quarter of all Prussian parishes were without priests. You can imagine if somebody tried that today in the United States, just started, let's say you get, say Joe Biden decides, all these bishops are against abortion, he just sort of exiles them all. That's what's going on here. It's amazing. But things begin to shift by 1875, variety of reasons. One of which I've already hinted at is that you already see this, is that the center party is actually growing in strength. By 1878, in the elections of 1878, the national elections in the Reichstag, the center party has achieved complete parity with the national liberals. At the same time, Pius IX dies in 1878. He's replaced by Leo XIII. Leo XIII is a great pope, but he's also a lot less combative than Pius IX. Pius IX was really pugnacious, and he was right to fight all this stuff, but it's also kind of true that his pugnaciousness made it hard to draw things down, which Leo XIII almost immediately did. He immediately opens up negotiations with Bismarck's government, as well as the Swiss government. At the same time, things shift politically as well, not just the center party, which, by the way, by 1881 has become the largest party in the Reichstag, but also with the Socialist Party. There's a socialist party in Germany, and at this point, Bismarck breaks with the liberals and passes an anti-socialist law in 1878, 1879, because he's becoming more and more concerned about socialism in the country. The next year, he dismisses Adalbert Falk, that's the liberal, secular minister of education, and gives his successor, some discretion to ameliorate the worst effects of the May laws. In Austria, liberal parties lose seats in parliament and therefore influence. And there, from then on, in the next few years, much of their Kulturkampf legislation is undone. 1882, diplomatic relations are finally restored between Germany and the Holy See. 1883, Bishop Mermiel is able to return to Geneva in Switzerland. But it's not until 1886 and 1887 that the May laws are finally modified, the worst aspects of them, by the so-called peace laws of that year. Basically, long story short, in order to sort of try to corral socialism and other left-wing radicals are becoming more of a problem, Bismarck makes his peace, essentially, with the Center Party, is what happens. However, other anti-Catholic laws are only repealed in 1890 and 91, and the last section of the law expelling Jesuits isn't rescinded until 1904, but it's not until 1917 that all the anti-Jesuit legislation was completely done away with. And then finally, between 1880 and 1886, the states of Baden and Hessen-Darmstadt in Germany repealed their laws, and then finally in 1890, which is why I choose that date for this the episode, the state of Bavaria finally relaxes its laws against control of the church. And thus the legal struggle against the church finally comes to an end in that year. And so after a good, again, the intense of it lasts about half a decade, basically, 1876, 1877. It begins to peter off after that. And then they finally draw back in the 1880s and 90s. What is the result? What are the results of all this? Well, one of the things that happened, and the German government and Bismarck just didn't understand Catholicism very well. One of the things that surprised them the most is that the Kulturkampf brought the laity and clergy together. It really strengthened the bond of German laity and clergy. You have to give credit to the German bishops. They actually stood up to these people, went to prison, went into exile. I hate to say this, it's hard to imagine many bishops doing that today, but that was really important. It really galvanized the laity, who they really were in lockstep. There wasn't a lot of people stepping out of line and going over to the other side because of all this. That really shocked the German state. It led, of course, to the creation of a very strong Catholic Center Party. Again, it's not officially Catholic, but it is a Catholic party. It will remain a permanent part of German life until the Nazis take power in the 30s. It also leads to the permanent resentment on the part of Catholics against Bismarck. They never really trust him ever again. They had to make deals with him because of their position. They're an embattled minority, but they never really trust the government in some ways ever again. And this is probably the biggest thing that comes out of this, despite the fact that it strengthens the church internally in a lot of ways in Germany. It leads to the formation of a really rigid separation between the world of Catholicism, its schools, its churches, but all of its sports leagues, everything really set almost like a sort of mutual apartheid between the church and Catholicism and the rest of the more secular national culture of Germany. So much so that by the early 20th century, you have a lot of Catholics begin to chafe against this. They want to get out and experience the wider world. And in fact, it's the German writers, we call them liberal Catholics, I guess, of the very early 20th century, who actually coined the term Catholic ghetto to refer to this sort of separation from the world, which, if you ever heard that term, it gets used by American Catholic writers before in the 1950s. I think it's John Tracy Ellis wrote an article about wanting Americans to come out of their ghetto because they had been separated from a hostile Protestant culture. And so that's a legacy of this. So why did this fail, by the way? That's one thing I want to talk about here is why did the German state not get away with this? I mentioned it before. I'll say it again. It just simply underestimated the solidarity of German Catholics. And again, part of this was because they had this idea that these Catholics were just sort of robots that did whatever their bishops told them. And once they got rid of the bishops, they would just collapse and fold. And they were totally they basically succumbed to their own side's propaganda about Catholicism, the caricature. And we're surprised by all this. Second thing is, and this I hinted at earlier, is that because the German state was kind of a confederation, they simply didn't have the sufficient police power to really enforce all these laws fully. A lot of these laws didn't get enforced fully, partly because they had to be enforced by these states that still had a lot of autonomy within the empire. Some of whom had Catholic officials who could, slow play things, look the other way. And so it was not a totalitarian state. Some Catholic, for obvious reasons, understandable reasons, rhetoric at the time made it sound like this was a dictatorship, but it really wasn't. It didn't have that kind of power. Another reason I mentioned this in fairness is that I should have mentioned this. I mentioned it briefly earlier. Most Protestants tended to identify their religion in Germany with the German state and with modernity. Most of them tended to see I stress this enough. The German state was born as a modernizing project. That's definitely something there. And pretty much all Protestants share in that. However, there are still some conservative Protestants who didn't like liberal Protestants and their anti-clericalism. That's really what happened. Is that as time went on, as the years went on, the rhetoric and even some of the legal ramifications of the Kulturkampf alienated conservative Protestants because they have a more higher view of the clergy than these liberals do. And then finally, the other thing I just mentioned as well throughout that little discussion is that socialism emerged in the eyes of Bismarck and others as a greater threat to the nation. Which is why, by the way, this is an aside, but Germany became the first country in history to enact something like Social Security in 1884. They passed law, not only like a social insurance law for people, but also workers' insurance, old age pensions. All this, by the way, was a means of trying to head off the threat of socialism. Didn't work, by the way. Didn't totally work either. So it failed both. Bismarck actually failed to sort of corral both of those perceived threats, I guess you could say, with his legislative accomplishments. Which shows you how complicated this actually is. There's a lot of things going on here. It's not just liberal secular people versus the church. It's the church. There's liberal Protestants. There's the liberal secular party. There's the nationalists with Bismarck. There's all these sorts of different, things going on that galvanize all this. Come together in this big conflict, but there's a lot of things going on there. And so what's the legacy of this for us today? One of the things to note about this, again, I mentioned this earlier in the podcast, this was a national conflict, but it's also an international conflict. The Kulturkampf, really, there's nothing unique about it that happened in Germany in terms of didn't happen elsewhere in the 19th century in Europe. France, Italy, Belgium, Switzerland, the Netherlands, virtually anywhere in Europe you had a sizable Catholic population, there was this kind of conflict. So it's both same types of beliefs at stake. So it's both. It happens at a national level, and there are things that are unique to Germany. I kind of mentioned them already throughout this podcast, but it's both actually. The second thing is that this conflict in particularly, these conflicts in the 19th century are kind of contingent. Let's say they're particular to their era, because this is the era of great national revolutions in which new nation states are claiming authority over their populations in a new way for the first time, which conflicts with something like the Catholic Church. We've, of course, since then learned to live with that. However, there's also something larger involved, which is that sense of a persistent clash of not between modernity and the church, which is anti-modern, which it kind of is in some ways, but what you're having here is a clash of differing responses to all these modern things that are going on. To industrialization, later on to post-industrialization, all that stuff, to all those things by yes, the Catholic Church, but also liberal secular civilization, and of course the Church, by the way, does its response didn't include at the time modernizing its beliefs. There are of course people today that think the Church should. They're wrong. We can't. But it is true that you have that clash as a result of all that stuff. It doesn't mean, by the way, there has to be a Kulturkampf every 5 minutes. But in certain situations, it can be brought to that, like it was in the 1870s. Hopefully not soon. It's not a good thing, honestly, because in the long run, again, the church survived in Germany, but it really was, in the long run, kind of a bad thing. kept them too cut off, kept them too, led to an overreaction to all that. It was good that it brought solidarity, of course, to German Catholicism, but also led to this sort of total, settling into a cocoon, as if you could hide forever in there. And you can't. You're going to have to come out and face the modern world at some point, which, again, that's a story for another time. The church tried to, of course, in the 20th century. In any event, that is our coverage of the Kulturkampf of the 1870s in Germany. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Hope you enjoyed the podcast. Please, if you have, again, if you liked it, please go to the Facebook page, like the page, like us on iTunes, subscribe on YouTube, wherever we're at. Go, bookmark the website, churchcontroversies.com. Please check us out. Please tell a friend if you like it. Remember, this is Controversies in Church History is a free podcast, and as long as I can keep doing this or want to do this, it shall be free. So I do this as a service for you guys. Let you guys know that. And hopefully, again, one last thing, just to reiterate, really thank all my listeners. Really appreciate you guys like it and find it useful. So thank you all for listening. God bless y'all. Have a great week, and you'll be hearing from me soon. Take care, and God bless.